All right, today we have another episode from the archives with one of my incredible guests. Enjoy. All right, guys, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. I am very excited to have as my guest today, Dr. Mark Epstein. Mark, welcome.
Hey, thank you. Nice to be here.
All right. So Dr. Epstein is a psychiatrist in private practice in New York City and the author of a number of books about the interface of Buddhism and psychotherapy, including Thoughts Without a Thinker, Going to Pieces Without Falling Apart, The Trauma of Everyday Life, and his latest work, Advice Not Given, A Guide to Getting Over Yourself. He received his undergraduate and medical degrees from Harvard University. Mark, again, it's a pleasure to have you on here. As I said, before we started recording, you've been someone who I've wanted to get on here for a long time, specifically because I feel the work you do epitomizes what I hope this podcast is about, bringing together a variety of fields, but in particular, Eastern thought, Buddhism in particular, and trauma. But before we get going here, first, share with the listeners where you're from and where you're calling from.
Sure. Well, I'm a psychiatrist. I mostly do psychotherapy in New York City, Lower Manhattan. Right now, I'm in Woodstock, New York, where we sometimes spend time. I've written a bunch of books, as you mentioned. All those books I've written one day a week, because mostly I see patients. So when I'm in Woodstock, that's my writing time. So
one day, what is that, like a zillion pages during that one day? Or
no, it's like one page or 2 pages over 2 years makes one book.
Okay.
Like that. Yeah.
So I have to say the trauma of everyday life, this whole idea, just something about it just calls to me, makes a lot of sense. I want to kind of get to that, but would you do us a favor and kind of, how did you get to this point?
Yeah, sure. I had the kind of unusual circumstances, and I would say lucky circumstances, of being exposed to Buddhist psychology, learning about Buddhist philosophy, learning to meditate, all in my early 20s, before I knew I was going to be a therapist and before I knew really very much about anything else. Somehow I was drawn to the Buddhist thing, and I got as deep into it as someone in their early 20s is able to do. I met a number of American Buddhist teachers, Jack Kornfield and Joseph Goldstein among them, names that would be familiar to people if they're at all interested in the field. I became friends with them. I studied with them. I did retreats with them. I traveled in Asia with them. And then after a sufficient amount of time, I decided I would give in to all the demands of my family and go to medical school, take the pre-med courses that I hadn't taken in college and apply to medical school with the idea of actually becoming a psychiatrist, because that appealed to me as a kind of work that wasn't really work. But that I thought I might be good at because I like talking with people. I'm interested in people. I'm curious about people and so on. So I did all that and trained as a psychiatrist. But my pre-existing interest in Buddhism served as a kind of lens or filter for me. So as I learned about Western psychology and psychoanalytic theory and psychodynamics and trauma and everything, I was always looking at it through the perspective of Buddhist thought. And I started writing, trying to figure out what I understood and what I didn't understand, whether the concepts of ego and egolessness and emptiness and attachment and desire that were common to both fields were the same. Was the ego in Buddhism the same as the ego in psychology or not? I didn't really know. I knew I needed an ego, but was I supposed to get rid of it also? Those kinds of questions were preoccupying me. So I began to write to try to figure out what I understood and what I didn't understand. And that led me into writing all of those books that you mentioned. And at the same time, I'm a therapist, and I see people, from various walks of life, a lot of creative people, I'm married to an artist, so the people who found me at the beginning tended to be in the creative fields. And I've been trying to figure out how to blend what I have understood or hope I've understood from the Buddhist world with what I've understood or hope I've understood from the psychotherapy world. So that's where I am.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. One of the things that kind of struck me in the book, specifically The Trauma of Everyday Life, was, trauma is, and obviously I'll let you kind of explore this more.
Yeah, no, you can say it. Trauma is ubiquitous.
Well, it is ubiquitous, but it's portrayed and looked at in very different ways, and especially on the continuum of what we know of trauma, and coming to terms with that when you read your book, I think can be a cold bucket of ice over someone's head. How did you begin to look at trauma in both of these worlds?
Well, that book, The Trauma of Everyday Life, started out for me. I wanted to write actually a psychobiography of the Buddha along the lines of Erik Erikson's famous work about Luther and about Gandhi. I was intrigued in my study of Buddhism. There's it's a well-known fact, but no one ever did anything with it, that the Buddha's mother dies when he's a week old. So he's raised by his father and his aunt, his mother's sister. And that always intrigued me as a therapist. Here's this figure who probably was a real person who lived 2,600 years ago, became the Buddha. His mother dies when he's a week old. Why is that in the story? Mm-hmm. In the traditional accounts, what's said is that because the Buddha, when he was 29 years old, was going to renounce his background and leave home, that would be too much for his mother to bear. So to spare her broken heart, they take her out when the Buddha's just a baby, so that she can watch over him from the heaven realms, But that seemed plausible, but not enough of an explanation for my psychotherapy mind. And I began to wonder if maybe, in psychodynamic language, we have this idea of big T trauma, like major trauma, like in war or traffic accidents or hurricanes or whatever, but also little t trauma, developmental trauma that takes place when we're young children, either because of intrusive parenting, alcoholic, abusive parents, or depressed parents, or else abandoning parents, where nothing happens when something maybe should have happened. Mm-hmm. So I thought, maybe this the Buddha's mother dying when he's a week old could be like a stand-in for what we call developmental trauma. And then I started to look at the Buddha's life history and his teachings, where his first proclamation after his enlightenment, he uses this word dukkha, life is dukkha, which is traditionally translated as suffering, that there's a sense of unsatisfactoriness that permeates human life. If you take the word dukkha apart, it actually means hard to face. They have a word sukha, which means sweet to face, which is like the pleasurable aspect of things. But dukkha means difficult to face. And I began to think that, that's like trauma. They didn't have a word for trauma, but trauma is what's difficult to face in all of our lives, mainly that we're going to die, that the people we love die, that there's old age, that there's illness, that there's separation from the beloved, that there's too much closeness with people we don't love. Those are all the things the Buddha itemized as dukkha. And that started me thinking about the traumatic undercurrent in everyday life. And so that's what the book turned into.
Mm-hmm. How do you recommend, or probably that's not even a good word, but people come into your office and they've suffered trauma. They might not even know they've suffered trauma. This blending of Buddhist thought, Asian thought, Eastern thought rather, and Western idea of trauma. Talk to us about that understanding or that lens that through which you look at it?
Well, the Western definition of trauma is basically difficult events occur, which create what we call unbearable affect or unbearable emotion. Affect is the word that gets used instead of feelings. But traumatic events evoke unbearable feelings in us as young children or as adults when we face the death of those around us or, difficult things of all sorts. And the instinctive reaction to the specter of unbearable affect is to what we call dissociate, which means to push away. The ego needs to preserve its own structure. So to do that, it pushes away that which threatens to overwhelm it, which are the unbearable feelings. So there's this kind of dissociation that happens in trauma, which we know from discussions of post-traumatic stress syndrome and so on, PTSD, veterans who come back who have pushed away their intense traumatic experiences, but you can push it away, you can put it in a closet, you can suppress it, but it comes out. It comes out in dreams, it comes out in intimate relationships, it comes out when the smell of the air evokes the feeling that you're trying not to allow. And so that strategy of dissociation is imperfect. So there are levels or gradations of dissociation. We all use dissociation to deal with the stresses and strains, the traumas of just being a person in a body, trying to make sense of being in the world. So when people come into the office, I have one ear out or one eye out or some feelers out for where those aspects that are hard to face, where are they? How are they going to manifest? And some, not everyone has that, but most people have some version of it. And in a trusting relationship, that is what we try to create in psychotherapy. And I think that's analogous to what we try to do in meditation. We try to create a trusting inner relationship in meditation. We try to create a trusting interpersonal relationship in psychotherapy. When that relationship is created, a relational home, we call it, then those feelings naturally present themselves. So there's a kind of impulse towards healing, towards wholeness that we all have. And when it's safe enough, people will start to reveal what's actually going on inside of them.
So when that relationship is created, you said these feelings will naturally kind of evince themselves.
They'll show themselves one way or another. Maybe not literally, but that's where dreams, in the traditional Freudian or Jungian sense, are important. Sometimes they'll manifest in the way that people actually relate to you as a therapist, or the way they relate to their own minds. People may act out the feelings rather than actually be able to say, oh, this was so upsetting to me. But one way or another, the feelings start to show themselves. And a skilled therapist or a skilled meditator can be sensitive to those feelings and make sense out of them.
In the West, we tend to very much kind of qualify these traumas in a sense. I mean, trauma is bad. Trauma is something that's, quote unquote, bad that's happened to us. In a Buddhist perspective, in an Eastern religious or psychological perspective, talk to us about that different perspective. Is it a different perspective?
Well, that's why I said at the beginning, trauma is ubiquitous. We have this idea of post-traumatic stress, and I like to say that if we're not suffering from post-traumatic stress, we're suffering from pre-traumatic stress, because it's going to happen to all of us.
Great.
one way or another. I really learned about trauma. I didn't have any special training in it. I was just doing therapy with whoever came into the office. But a patient of mine found me. A new patient found me after losing her entire family in the 2004 tsunami. She was in Asia vacationing with her husband and her 2 young children and her parents at an eco resort, a nature resort. on an island, and the tsunami came and swept them all up in the waters, and everyone died but her. She survived by holding on to a tree branch, as she got washed up by the waves. And somehow she met the daughter of someone I had treated after the World Trade Center, who said, "Oh, you should maybe come and see this person. Maybe he could help you." And she ended up in my office in Lower Manhattan. And I didn't know how to help other than sitting across from me. She had 2 children, and my wife and I have 2 children, so I know what it is to have 2 children. And in the office, it didn't make that much difference if they were alive or dead. I still wanted to know about her children, so I started to ask her questions about her children, and that was the beginning. Because even she hadn't been able to go back to her house in England. She hadn't been able to look at any of the photographs. Just getting her to talk about her children was the beginning of allowing the unbearable feelings of loss to mix with her pre-existing feelings of love. And over many years, I learned so much from her about, we tend to see people like her as suffering from a kind of singularity, like, oh, there's no way I could understand what you're going through. That's what people would always say, but it's not hard to understand. Even that kind of trauma, we all are going to face the death of the people we're closest to. Either we die or they die, Mm-hmm. So it's actually a extremely common experience. She just had it all compressed into one moment.
And in terms of, walking through that or the healing process, what did that look like? I mean, we can talk about that person if that's okay, or talk more generally. But
sure, it looks the same. In anytime there's anytime there's any kind of what we call healing, it has to do with it not following some kind of prescribed path. Like the ideas that we have coming out of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's work about death. That there's a progression of stages. First denial, and then anger, and then bargaining, and then acceptance. And so people are like looking at themselves like, oh, I should be at acceptance now at a year or 2 years or whatever. And my experience is that it doesn't, that's a nice schema. And there's schemas like that in the meditation world for how you're supposed to get enlightened. First you experience impermanence, and then you experience suffering, and then you're released. It doesn't, the paths, the maps don't do justice to what the actual experience is. Mm-hmm. So my experience with people who have suffered big traumas like we're talking about now is that the pain doesn't go away. The intensity of the loss doesn't go away, but the feelings of love, which in the initial shock, people feel like they have to push down because it's too scary to still be vulnerable in that way. Those feelings start to come back. So in terms of acceptance, the acceptance is of the entire mix of intense emotion that is part of the experience of love and loss, part of the experience of being human. And it's analogous to people who come to terms in some kind of way with the pain of their childhood, that they're able to incorporate those difficulties into who they have become, without raging in some kind of violent way against the injustice that was done to them. They're able to use the traumas of daily life as portals or windows into something greater about themselves. What we call in Buddhism their true nature.
Is that a different way of looking at the healing process than, generally speaking, in the Western world, where we do try to push it down? And
Well, I think in the Western world, we're mostly trying to get people better as therapists, and the general mindset is to, what does resilience mean? It means to keep going. It means, if you've lost your husband or your wife, like, well, okay, when are you going to find your next one, kind of thing. But I think if you read the really good therapists who are doing work around this, some of them trained in Eastern thought and many of them not, they're coming from the same place. They understand this idea of there's no simple cure for everybody. You have to help people find their own way, that the relational home that's established one way or another is critical for that kind of healing, that the ability to make sense out of complicated, conflicting, mixed feelings is important for a sense of maturity and being able to go on, in a grown-up way, whatever that might mean. I think you see these elements even without the Eastern influence.
So you mentioned this idea of helping. How do you define that in a sense? I mean, you're walking into your office in lower Manhattan, you're sitting there. How are you defining helping? And that look different for each patient that walks in too.
Yeah, well, it's definitely different for each patient that walks in, but in terms of what I'm trying to do, it's pretty much the same. And I like to use the language. There was a famous British pediatrician and psychiatrist named Donald Winnicott, who started out treating children, and then mostly in his day, the 40s and 50s, mothers and their children. And he originated the phrase, the good enough mother, one who's not too intrusive or too abandoning. We would say the good enough parent now. But when Winnicott talked about what that meant, he was using parenting as a way of talking about therapy also. What is a therapist doing? And he talked about the holding environment, that what a mother does for a baby is hold the baby in a way that's sensitive to what the baby is going through. So by holding, he's talking about a physical holding, but also an emotional or a mental holding, that a parent instinctively is sensitive to the emotions, the feelings of the infant, even while the infant for the first 3 years or so doesn't have the cognitive or the mental capacity to say to themselves, to understand what they're feeling. They're completely dependent on the parent to, in a kind of mirroring way, to make it okay what they're feeling. They're hungry and they're screaming, and the parent is able to say, it's okay, it's going to be okay. That kind of, they communicate that. So the holding environment of the therapy office is very important. So I'm trying to put myself into that place, which I also have learned from meditation, where I'm not being the aloof, blank screen, 1950s psychoanalyst. I'm there with the person. We sit face to face. They're not lying on a couch or anything. I'm there, but I'm present, but I'm hopefully not intruding too much with my own agenda, either trying to get them better or trying to talk about my own experience. I'm there. Winnicott used to talk about being used, that being used as a parent or as a therapist was the most fulfilling kind of thing. We want to be used properly. So I'm trying to make myself available to be used in whatever way will be helpful for that particular person at that particular moment. And that requires a kind of improvisational dance, which I find very satisfying.
We have a lot of people who are listening to this who are therapists of various kinds and with various levels of experience. But for those newer clinicians, maybe they're just starting out or maybe they're even in school, talk a little bit, Mark, about how this is a big question here, but what the arc of your presence was like from when you first started out and to now. I mean, I would imagine that might have been looked very different.
It's hard for me to say. To me, it looks totally the same. I remember when I was first, I was trained coming out of medical school. So in medical school, you do 2 months of surgery and 3 months of medicine and a month of dermatology, a month of psychiatry, and the training is all the same. In most of the fields, you watch the doctors do whatever they do a procedure, and you learn how to do it, and then they let you do it, for the first time. In psychiatry and psychotherapy, there aren't any procedures. So in my first rotations as a therapist, at some point they just hand you a patient and you go into the room and it's just you and the patient and you're the therapist, even if you're in medical school or an intern or a resident, a fellow, whatever it is. So, and they don't really give you any training in how to be a therapist. If you're coming up as a psychologist or a social worker, or if you go to a psychoanalytic institute, you might get more actual kind of at least theoretical training. As a medical doctor, you get hardly any, a little bit, but hardly any. So that no one was there watching me with my patients. And I didn't really know what to do. I had two things to draw on. One, my meditation experience, which was already very well established. So I knew how to be in relationship to my own mind. And I figured, if I can pay attention to this person's mind the way I've learned to pay attention to my mind, maybe that will be quote unquote therapeutic. Mm-hmm. And I had been in therapy already, so I did have the experience of being the patient. And I had been in therapy with a Gestalt therapist who was very present with me. Gestalt therapy uses the intricacies of the present moment to try to look at what's the person avoiding, or how is the person avoiding being present with me, the therapist. So I had those two things to draw on, and I basically had to learn how to deploy those techniques, and I'm still learning it's the same process. So I was always more comfortable as the therapist than I was as a person in the real world. So when
you first started out, Mark, mm-hmm. Why did you want to get into therapy? Or why did you want to become a therapist?
Why did I want to become a therapist? As I think I mentioned at the beginning, it seemed like work that wasn't really work. So I was looking for something I could do,
Right.
I wasn't going to be good at surgery or at making things, whatever talents I might have had lay in the interpersonal.
And in terms of your idea of helping, I want to get into this field.
Yeah.
What was that? I mean, I guess I'm curious about how that might be different from now, because a lot of times people get into the field because they want to help, they want to fix, right? They want to.
I think it was a little different for me. I grew up in an academic family, and my father was a professor of medicine. He was first at Yale, and then he was at Harvard. His whole life, he loved being a doctor, a researcher. I had a lot of pressure, subtle but real pressure from him to follow in his footsteps. He was a kidney doctor. He would always draw like pictures of the kidney for me, and my mom. I would dissociate. That was trauma for me. I could never understand the kidney, But so when I found Buddhism and meditation, it was like, oh, this is mine, and something in me really relaxed. And that let me then, instead of resenting my father's input, it softened me around that. And I realized, oh, this is sort of what I have been bred to do, I knew I wasn't intimidated by professors of medicine at Harvard Medical School. I knew, and somehow I was good at the math and the chemistry and whatnot. And I knew I could get in. I knew how to play that game. I think becoming a psychiatrist was as far away as I could get, while still being within the field. And that worked for me. That was, I don't know without that pressure and help from my father, I probably would have gone, in some other, maybe I would have been an academic Buddhist professor or something. When I first got to medical school, I thought, this is horrible. You just have to memorize all this endless material and regurgitate it. And I started having trouble sleeping, and I tried to drop out. I went to the Simmons School of Social Work and talked to the admissions people there and said, I just want to be a therapist. I'm interested in Buddhism. I want to try to bring Buddhism into the world of therapy. I don't need this. I don't want to go this whole medical route. And they looked at me like I was crazy, like you're going to drop out of Harvard Medical School to come to our social work school. And my father had me go around and talk to a couple of well-known psychiatrists who were very kind to me and reinforced this idea that turned out to be true, that I would have a lot more autonomy to do the kind of work I already knew I kind of wanted to do, bringing the Buddhist, translating Buddhism into psychological language, that I'd have a lot more autonomy if I completed the path, and put my time in. So I listened to them, and they were right.
I just want to remind everyone that I'm speaking with Dr. Mark Epstein. His website is markepsteinmd.com. I'll have everything linked up here at the show notes page, traumatherapistpodcast.com. So Mark, as we kind of close down here, what would you say to those younger therapists listening, those people just starting out, in terms of learning about trauma, even learning how to sit with trauma when someone's patient or client is sitting across from you? What would you say to them?
I could talk about it in a couple of different ways. If you're drawn at all to the world of Buddhist thought, if you're interested in meditation and mindfulness, etc., then, or even in the practice of yoga, physical yoga, then learn about that for yourself. Because what they're trying to teach you about how to relate to your own mind is going to help you in relating to other people's minds. So first, work on yourself. That I think is almost goes without saying. It's not right for everyone, but if you feel it inside of you as something you're drawn to, then let yourself pursue it and learn about it. Not by surrendering to some teacher, some guru. You don't have to swallow everything, but take what seems good for you and use it for yourself. Secondly, I think there's very evolved conversation happening now in the psychotherapy world about trauma and about what does it mean to be a therapist. And I would say, don't neglect the psychoanalytic world. I'm not a psychoanalyst, but I've learned so much from the world of psychoanalysis. And there's a real tendency now that mindfulness has come in, and dialectical behavioral therapy and cognitive therapy, are really on the upswing. And people got disillusioned with psychoanalysis, and it's often not even taught anymore. But I would say there's so much to be learned, so much that people understood about the complexities of the therapist-client relationship. That's so helpful. And, there's a psychoanalyst named Robert Stolorow, Stolorow, who has a beautiful little book about trauma that I reference in my trauma book. Trauma and human something it's called. It's a tiny little book. It's excellent. There's a compilation of Winnicott's writings for lay people, talks he gave to like breastfeeding leagues and radio talks called Babies and Their Mothers by Winnicott that I look at all the time. There's a little biography of Winnicott by Adam Phillips. Adam Phillips is a wonderful writer. His most famous book is On Kissing, Tickling, and Being Bored. But he has a little biography of Winnicott that was the first thing I ever read about Winnicott. There's a book by Michael Eigen, E-I-G-E-N, called The Psychoanalytic Mystic, which a lot of people don't know about, but is a beautiful description of what it means to try to use these ideas in psychotherapy, drawing on Lacan and Winnicott and Bion. So those are some places that people could start.
Awesome. I'll have those linked up. Mark, it was an honor having you on here. I'm thrilled, and I'm really excited to get this out to my audience. I want to thank you so much for joining me today.
Pleasure.
All right, take care.
Thanks. Bye.